Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Europe Center. My name is Christophe Cambé, and I'm very happy to introduce our speaker for today, William Drozdiak. William Drozdiak is a Global Europe Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's had a very long and distinguished career. He's been a foreign editor for the Washington Post for a very long time, and during that time, the Washington Post won several Pulitzer Prizes for their coverage of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, of Russian politics. He is also was instrumental in setting up the Brussels Center, the Transatlantic Center for the German Marshall Fund. He was executive director there. He was also at some point chief European correspondent for the Washington Post. He also worked for the New York Times. And maybe most importantly, he was very early on in his career, he was drafted as a player for the Golden State Warriors. From the Warriors, he moved on to even better teams, and it is teams in the great country of Belgium, where he played for Mechelen, I believe, a nice city very close to my own hometown of Leuven also. William has also written some great books on Europe and on transatlantic relations. He's recently written a book about Emmanuel Macron and his presidency. So I'm sure that even if he is not going to talk specifically about that today, that we'll get to ask some questions about Macron and the next presidential race. If nobody else does, I will definitely do that. So today, William is going to talk about the latest tensions in the transatlantic relations after the pullout from Afghanistan and the submarine deal that the U.S. signed with Australia, annoying the French in the process. And he's going to address the question whether these are just temporary problems or profound shifts, or signify profound shifts in the transatlantic relations. I won't talk anymore, and I will give the floor to Bill.
Well, thank you very much, Christophe, and thank you all for coming. It's a great pleasure to be back on the Stanford campus, which I remember from my days playing basketball for the University of Oregon. Coming down here, Stanford was a main rival, and as Christophe said, I was drafted by the Warriors, but ended up playing for 7 years in Europe, and that was my introduction to Europe, where I had a wonderful set of experiences, and that did my graduate studies there, and then moved into journalism with the Washington Post, covering Europe. So I've had good 40 years of a close involvement, and I even married a Belgian diplomat who happens to be in this room. Here we are 40 years later. Well, it's a very important inflection point, I think, for the transatlantic partnership for a number of reasons. It's amazing in some respects that it hasn't, this certain crossroads hasn't occurred sooner, because 30 years ago, with the end of the Cold War, a lot of people thought that the Atlantic Alliance and NATO and the institutions had sort of lost their compass, lost their focus, that with the end of the Soviet threat, there was no conceivable reason to sustain this partnership, which has been the most successful in the history of the world, in the sense that as a collective multinational defense, NATO managed to triumph in the Cold War without firing a shot. And since then, the economic relationship has been vitally important as well. And even today, with the rise of China and India, we see the trade and investment flows between the United States and Europe still account for more than 40% of the global economy. So it shows that this relationship remains very important, but I really believe it has to adapt with the shifting tides of history. And I thought I'd divide my remarks into three parts today. One, doing a quick survey of the political landscape in Europe, the centrifugal forces that I think are driving the quest for a more integrated political community in Europe apart. In fact, I wrote a book called Fractured Continent that describes these crises as they were beginning to merge about 5 or 6 years ago. And then I will go on to describe the current state of the Atlantic Alliance and the forces that are also changing there, particularly as the United States shifts its strategic focus to China and its efforts to dominate the Indo-Pacific region. And finally, I'll end up with a description of what I think lies ahead, what might be the best approach for the United States and Europe to assume in the years to come as a way to sustain this partnership and still retain an influential role as the leading free market democracies in the world, because we've had this relationship now for more than 70 years, which is rare to see an alliance sustain that long during the course of history. But I think it's important for the world to have Europe and the United States in the primary leadership positions that will sustain free market democracies. Well, the big challenge in Europe, I think today, as we saw play out in the recent European summit, is the dangerous divide between East and West, notably the illiberal regimes in Poland and Hungary, the drift toward authoritarianism that we see there, particularly in terms of the crackdown on free speech and dissent, and the packing of the courts with political cronies, which are reminiscent in some ways of what we've seen in other countries that start to drift away from free market democracies and take on an authoritarian tinge. The Prime Minister of Poland last week said, if Europe decides to curtail the subsidies as has been threatened recently, that this would be tantamount to launching a third world war within the European Union. But there's no, that may be a little bit of excessive rhetoric, but there's no question that the tensions are extreme. And the leaders in the European Union, notably Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, has insisted that something has to be done about this. Otherwise, the toleration of breaking the rules of law within the European Union could drive the union apart, because there are other countries that could have similar grievances that in which they would violate the EU. The second big change that we see, of course, is with the recent German election, the end of the Angela Merkel era, who was leaving power after 16 years. I found that Merkel was not a great leader in a European sense, in that she lacked a strategic vision for the continent. And indeed, in my last book, while I was reporting out, having a number of conversations with Emmanuel Macron, he said one of his biggest frustrations was trying to get her to move toward a greater leap forward toward a political integrated community. And she was reluctant to do so. He wanted to emulate what we had seen in the past between Helmut Kohl, Francois Mitterrand, and indeed all the way back to Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle, that the two leaders of France and Germany need to be on the same page in order to drive Europe forward in a helpful way. And Merkel's achievements, which are significant, particularly in opening up the doors to immigration in Germany in 2015 and bringing in over 1 million refugees, who, by the way, have been very well integrated. It's one of the big success stories that we don't hear about, is how they've become an important part of the German economy. But that she was reluctant to move toward a banking union in the economic sense, but also toward a more common European and foreign and security policy that Macron has been insisting upon. And indeed, that's been even more significant because of the recent, the chaotic exit from Afghanistan, the continuing problems in Iraq and elsewhere, and also the fight over Iran. So I think with Merkel leaving now, the next chancellor, Olaf Scholz of the SPD, has said he wants to work more closely with Macron to realize the vision of a more dynamic Europe, which both of them say is important with the resurgence of big power rivalry, pitting the United States against Russia and China. And indeed, as I'll get into, this is really at the core of the current tensions within the transatlantic relationship that are threatening to break up the alliance. There's also a new migration crisis happening. You may have read about how Belarus is trying to push illegal immigrants out into Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. This has generated tensions that have really presented those governments with some acute dilemmas. Do they try to push these immigrants back into Belarus? And then it becomes a contest with whether they can be more brutal and fearful than Lukashenko, which I think is not the kind of battle that European leaders want to fight. The other threat that is emerging is the resurgence of illegal immigration coming across the Mediterranean Sea from North Africa and indeed continental Africa. And this shows the impact of climate change and how that is creating a desperate surge of refugees who are seeking to come to Europe. You just have to look at the situation around Lake Chad, which sustains 15 million people on a daily basis with water and fish. And the fact that Lake Chad is in the process of drying up. Within 5 to 10 years, it will be completely parched and dry. Those people then have to move right away. And already you see a big movement of people coming up from continental Africa, fleeing not just drought and climate change problems, but also civil wars. And the place they want to go is Europe, where many of them may have relatives. And this has become a big factor in the French election campaign, which will the election will be held next April. Emmanuel Macron is seeking a second term, but so far the campaign discussions have been focused entirely on immigration, how to stop the continuing flow. Indeed, Michel Barnier used to be a member of the European Commission and supervised the negotiations over Brexit, has come out saying there should be a moratorium of 5 years of stopping all immigration, which is the kind of proposal that we've heard in the past from far-right populists such as Marine Le Pen. But you can see how these positions now are becoming more and more mainstream when people like Michel Barnier start advocating them in the context of a political campaign. And next, in terms of Europe's current landscape, the big issue I think that is looming in the months to come is the global energy crisis. Natural gas has quadrupled in price, which is putting enormous stress on the economies of a number of European companies. Oil is now at $85 a barrel. And with the completion of the Nord Stream 2 facility that was pushed through at Angela Merkel's behest, and which has satisfied Vladimir Putin no end, we see now Putin manipulating to some extent the natural gas prices in a way that the US President Biden had warned could result from the Nord Stream 2 project being finished. This has given Russia a tool to exercise political leverage over Europe in the future. And interestingly, we will have to watch what the new German government does, because this is one issue where the Green Party, which is likely to play a significant role as the second biggest force in the likely coalition of SPD, Greens, and Liberals, they have been adamantly opposed to the Nord Stream 2 project. So whether they will go as far as to refuse to put it into effect remains to be seen, but it's significant that they are taking a much tougher attitude toward both Russia and also the human rights abuses in China, and they are likely to be in charge of the foreign ministry when the negotiations are completed. But I think that'll happen fairly soon. So I think these are the main challenges that we see politically in Europe at this time, and how they resolve these will have an impact on the evolution of relations with the United States. I mentioned the dismay that was felt in a number of countries in Europe, not just France, over the chaotic exit from Afghanistan. There's an attitude I sense in Europe is that when we follow the United States into war in Iraq and Afghanistan, these have become misbegotten adventures, and we don't want to do that anymore. And that kind of talk is you're hearing more and more when it comes to how to deal with the rise of China. The aggressive approach taken by the Biden administration has been challenged in Europe, not just by Angela Merkel in Germany and Emmanuel Macron, but also across a number of other countries who feel that they are being led into, if their test of accepting American leadership of the alliance is to follow the United States into an armed confrontation with China, then they think this would be a disaster for the alliance and for their own national interests. So it's going to be the litmus test, I think, for this alliance, because this is one of the few issues in our country where Republicans and Democrats seem to agree that standing up to China, taking a tougher attitude toward any threats that they may make against Taiwan is something that, while it may unite the Biden administration with the Republicans, it's something that really sows discord within the alliance. We mentioned earlier the Alcus affair, in which the nuclear attack submarines that will be built for Afghanistan replaced a 60 billion euro deal that the French had This has generated a firestorm of criticism and also a lingering resentment that we Europeans, and not just French, can no longer trust the word of an American president. And there's been a great effort to try to repair the damage with Secretary Blinken and President Biden reaching out to Macron and his government. But in my latest conversation with the French ambassador, they say there's still a lot of work to be done to repair this. But what really grates the French is that they are perhaps the only country in Europe with the capability to project power into the Indo-Pacific. And I was invited down to French Polynesia last May by the head of French naval forces to assist at the Jeanne d'Arc exercises with the 7th Fleet, and also learn more about the French presence there. And it is significant. It's, to me, we should have tried to bring France as the only European power with a presence in the Indo-Pacific into this budding alliance with Australia and Japan and India, because the French have 5 military bases in the Indo-Pacific. They have 2 million citizens scattered around those islands, and so they have significant interest. And this would have been a way to bridge whatever misunderstandings there are with Europe. So I hope that becomes something that can develop and perhaps enable us to find a way out of this conflict that we have with the French. But that's still not going to change the fundamental approach of the Europeans who see China as a great source of lucrative trade. 60% of Europe's trade is conducted with China, and that's why you see even the German government, led by Angela Merkel, saying with 70% of their economy tied to the automobile industry, and that their most lucrative sales from the big automakers are going to China, they don't want to do anything that could jeopardize that trade. So I might wrap up my remarks by saying that where do we go from here? I mentioned that the idea that bringing France into the Alcus forum as a way to have a European presence in dealing with China would be helpful. I think that also these other budding institutions, such as the Quad, which has now had 2 summits to discuss how to cope with the rising threat of China. I think that would also be helpful to bring France into this, call it the Quint or the 5, the Big 5, but it would be helpful to have a European presence in dealing with that challenge. And then also on, of course, on Russia, it's important for the United States and Europe to coordinate their positions on this. Europe has had a difficult time reconciling of how to deal with President Vladimir Putin. When in my conversations with Macron, he made the point that we need to find a way to draw Putin back toward the West and away from seeking an embrace with China as, you know, a link up between 2 authoritarian regimes. And I said, well, what's the evidence of that? You've been trying to do this, but you haven't really succeeded. And he said, well, I'm convinced that deep down inside, Putin realizes he has to have a relationship with the West. And he said, because after all, he's a son of St. Petersburg. And I said, well, I would say rather he's a son of the KGB, in his attitudes to power, because both Macron and Merkel have said in differing interviews that I've had with them that whenever they raise the discussion of strategic interests with Putin, notably, look, why are you picking a fight with the West? Your problems lie in the East and also in the South with the threat of Islamic fundamentalism. They say that Putin immediately shuts down and insists that this is all the West problem, that the West is provoking a fight with Russia. But it's clear that he's doing this as a way to distract the Russian people from a lot of the problems at home, generate some nationalist fervor that would enable him to sustain his power for the years to come. So there's a exercise going on now at NATO called NATO 2030, which is trying to draw up a new strategic concept for the challenges facing the alliance. I mean, this is long overdue, but at least they're making a belated effort. It is supposed to be unveiled in Madrid at a summit next summer. I think that while addressing new conflicts, dealing with cybersecurity and other challenges, and also coping with the consequences of climate change, I think there needs to be a new emphasis on redrawing the responsibilities because of defense and security, particularly for Europe. Because I think that, as we've heard for a number of years now, warnings from not just President Obama, but Defense Secretary Gates and others, saying that there's a growing sense of impatience and frustration with the perception that European countries have been free riders in terms of their depending on the United States as their security blanket, their security umbrella, and that politically it's becoming harder and harder to sustain support for that. And that certainly will be an issue in the 2024 presidential campaign if Donald Trump is the Republican candidate. So I think that the Europeans realize that the time is coming when they will have to accept greater responsibility, particularly if they are perceived by the American people as not joining with the United States in confronting China as an existential threat to American leadership in the world. So these are important and challenging times for what I consider to be one of the great achievements in terms of history of the Atlantic Alliance. But I think it needs to adapt to these new challenges, these new threats, particularly while Europe and the United States are going through difficult times at home in terms of the polarization of political thought. It's clear that the threats from authoritarian regimes in China and Russia represent a common threat to us all, both in Europe and the United States. But we have to find a more effective way of redressing our mutual grievances, get Europe to do more and do it more efficiently in terms of their own defense, so that the United States can focus its resources on the Indo-Pacific and the challenges to come. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. So now we have about half an hour or so for questions. I will first ask a question myself, then I will turn to the audience here at Stanford, and then I will go through the questions that have been asked by the audience online. So if you're following this talk online, you can use the Q&A session to ask some more questions. I'll just ask one quick question first. You mentioned that at the very beginning, you mentioned the problems that the EU has in dealing with countries like Poland and Hungary. Poland has been especially a problem in the past few days and weeks. A lot of people in Western Europe were disappointed about the position taken at the European Council. They thought that Macron, and I mentioned Macron specifically because maybe you can give some insight in the way he thinks about it, that Macron and Merkel were way too nice for the Polish government and should have taken a harsher stance on the fact that basically Poland declared, or the Polish court that was basically set up by the current government, that the Polish laws are above EU laws, which is a contradiction with the EU treaties. So a lot of people would have liked Macron and others to react more strongly. Why do you think he has not done that?
Well, I think it's they realize that an out and out challenge now would be something that would be catastrophic for the European Union. I mean, it's true that the Poles, for example, get 2 billion euros per month in subsidies from the European Union. And a number of leaders have said if they are violating European laws, there have to be sanctions. I think Macron is willing to go along that, even at the risk of provoking a crisis. Merkel is much more. She's always been somebody who really shies away from direct conflict, and in this case, which was her valedictory appearance at a European summit, she said we must find a peaceful compromise. We can't attack China, Poland head on with sanctions, because this will break up the European Union. And I think that again has been a shortcoming in her leadership, not just with Poland, but also in dealing with Viktor Orban in Hungary. I think unless Europe stands up for the rule of law, then the European Union itself will see that its own status with the public will dissipate, and that will lead eventually to more countries wanting to leave the European Union.
Okay. Questions? Okay.
Thanks. Really interesting talk. I noticed one thing you didn't mention in your big three challenges was Ukraine. And so, as we think about European relationships with Russia and China, surely this is a big problem, right? I mean, the whole reason that Macron says we need to bring Putin back to the West, but that's one of the reasons he shifted so much to China is because of the sanctions, right? With Ukraine. So I can't see any reason, especially when I'm a Russia specialist, I can't see any reason why he would shift that under sanctions and getting good trade and building trade relations with China, especially at a time when China needs more energy. So can you say something about where you see the whole Ukraine conflict fitting in here in Europe's role and perhaps helping to settle that as it gets back some responsibility for some security?
Right. No.
Could you briefly repeat the question, because people online are complaining they cannot hear the questions from the audience.
I didn't hear it very well myself, but I think it's why Europe is not focused.
Ukraine question mark. But thanks.
Yeah, that would be helpful.
You want me to do it again? Okay. I'm always tempted to sing when handed a microphone like this. But, so my question was, since you spent so much time talking about the threat of Russia as well as China, it was notable that you didn't mention the Ukraine issue. And when you think about why China is attractive to Russia as a partner at the moment, surely it has a lot to do with the fact that the U.S. and Europe has Russia under pretty tight sanctions. And so looking around for different trade partners and also customers for its oil and gas, China is a pretty obvious partner. So when we say, when you say you want to turn Russia, or Macron wants to try to turn Russia back toward the West because he's a son of St. Petersburg,
well, he's also, the leader of Russia and has to keep its economy moving, right? So what leverage would we have if not settling the Ukraine crisis somehow? So anyway, just notable you didn't mention Ukraine.
No, I agree with the premise of your question in that there's been insufficient attention paid both by Europe and the U.S. administration toward the plight faced by Ukraine, particularly in light of the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. There were promises that Ukraine would not be left in the lurch, that there would be aid forthcoming that would help them cope with whatever loss of $2 billion a year in oil transfers. But so far, there's been very little follow-up, and I think that's really shameful, and it's tragic. I think Merkel and Macron have come around to the view that they just can't solve everything. And I think when I was reporting out the book Fractured Continent and met with Merkel 3 times, she one point said, look, I've had 80 conversations with Vladimir Putin about Ukraine, and we've gotten nowhere. And at some point, you have to realize that this is a fruitless quest. And this is what I think her frustration is certainly borne out. I mean, and Macron has tried to pick up where she left off, and he hasn't really succeeded. So I don't know, has this emboldened Putin in terms of his aggressive attitude toward the West, toward neighboring countries? It could well be, and it's. I know Macron was facing a lot of resistance within his own foreign ministry about his efforts to reach out to Putin. But whenever I challenged him on that, about the fact that his efforts to try to embrace Putin and generate a dialogue were fruitless and were seen as a sign of weakness for him, he became quite agitated and thought that this is, he says, what is the alternative? We're not talking about just Putin, we're all talking long-term relationship with Russia. And he insisted that Europe will never know stability until it can achieve a lasting relationship with Russia that establishes greater security on both sides. So this may be a question of wishful thinking on their part, and I also think it has not been picked up sufficiently, I think, by the Biden administration either. In terms of now that we have some leadership in the administration in terms of filling up these positions, because in the first 9 months of the Biden, I think even now, only one out of 4 national security positions have been filled. So there have just been too few people to deal with some of these challenges. And with only 2 ambassadors in place, I mean, it's ridiculous. We still have not confirmed Julie Smith as ambassador to NATO and all of these other countries. And it's hard to conduct a foreign policy when you're being blocked by silly notions put forward by your Republican opponents.
Thank you for the talk. It was very, very interesting and nice to be in the room talking about Europe. So I wanted to ask you a little more about NATO and about this, NATO 2030, to the extent that you know what might be coming. I mean, in the beginning, you started out with NATO and you talked about partnership. And anytime I think about partnership in NATO, I think, well, there's a senior partner and there's a junior partner, if that. In other words, NATO has been an instrument of American foreign policy since the very beginning, and the Europeans are more or less along for the ride, and the French really haven't liked it at times, as you know. And pulled out and then in again. And so I guess my question is, do you think there are, and then I'm just asking what you're thinking, really, whether the inherent contradictions within NATO that have grown up over the years is going to make this new strategic vision something that will really be substantially different. You say we're at an inflection point. I mean, are we really? Or are we just going to get the same thing warmed over again, which is, deep contradictions between the way Americans look at NATO and, the way Europeans, many Europeans look at NATO?
Yeah, no, all those are fair points. And I think why I think this is an inflection point is that after so many years of criticism from both sides, I think the issues are coming to a fore now, where driven largely by the shift of American strategic focus toward the Indo-Pacific, has awakened in Europe the recognition that it is unhealthy for this dependency 30 years after the Cold War of Europeans on the American security umbrella, that they need to do more for their own defense, yet they don't know how to go about it. They don't want, a lot of countries, neighboring Germany, are reluctant to see full-scale, massive defense budgets in Germany. Well, how would it be used? I think the best approach would be to have a curtailing of American responsibility, keep America in NATO as a leadership role, because I think the American presence has clearly helped attenuate some of the tensions among European countries. But I think it's important for the Europeans to realize that there's a growing amount of impatience among American voters, who will in turn elect future leaders, who say, why at more than 70 years after the founding of the Atlantic Alliance, 30 years after the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, with no clear threat on the horizon, that Europe is rich enough and strong enough to defend itself against whatever threat. I mean, the European Union countries spend 4 times as much on defense as Russia does, and yet they do it very inefficiently. So they're very fearful of the threat. It's true, the Baltic states, Eastern countries, have a more immediate fear of Soviet aggression than the others do. In Southern Europe, the threat is more about the instability generated by illegal immigration. So even within the European Union, there is not a consensus as to what kind of a threat Russia poses. I mentioned the efforts by Macron and Merkel to reach out to Putin, despite him thumbing his nose at the West for so long. And so in the absence of any clear consensus, I think American leadership, or at least American refereeing of these differences within NATO is important. But the point about why I think this is an inflection point is that the rise of China has reached a point now where the administration is looking at a dramatic transfer of resources from the European theater toward the Indo-Pacific. And the Europeans have been slow to wake up to this. But I think how this is translated into the NATO Strategic 2030 plan is still being fought out. And the fact that we don't have some of our key people in positions like a NATO ambassador is really tragic for our own interests.
Thank you, Maciej Post. I just wanted to briefly comment on your remarks about the perceived failure in German leadership or Angela Merkel's leadership as a weakness, lack of vision for a more kind of integrated Europe. I would say that this is probably more the effect of difference in interests. For Germany, a more a kind of vision of Europe of two speeds, leaving behind the Central Eastern countries would be, it would simply not be in their economic interest, because the market, Poland, is a great market for Germany, not so much for France. So that's why it was simply not in the German interest to realize this vision. And it's more generally, I think, there are, European Union has a number of regions that have those differing interests, and that's why the French leadership, with this vision of de-emphasizing NATO, of faster integration within the hardcore of old Union, that's something that wouldn't be acceptable for many European countries. Also because of what you said of the French, the traditional French Russophilia, and not appreciating this threat that Russia poses to, especially countries, as you said, like the Baltic States, for which it is an existential threat. Not also because the sizable Russian minorities in these countries, which would could lead to realizing something like the Ukrainian scenario. And so, and I also think that this may be the reason. I'm from Poland, by the way, so I have this perspective of this crisis in the European Union now. That I don't know if you share this, but I think that the position of Polish government is also somehow directed to Polish internal politics, and it's this is this identity politics that they trying to emphasize their sovereignty. We are not going to to obey European law because it's threatening our sovereignty. But on the other hand, the other pillar of this politics is the money that they get from there and the social transfers that they can do to win the election. So I don't think it's really, it's going to drive Poland out of European Union. At some point, they will probably do a step back and withdraw from some of those changes in the judicial system that are most contested. So I think it's more kind of, especially that in the Polish government there is this. Sorry. Yeah. So I just wanted to ask. How serious is this crisis? Do you think how it will unfold? Does it really threaten with the breakup of the European Union, or is it something that will be resolved quite quickly?
Well, I think the leadership of the European Union is coming around the view that despite the soft approach is not working with the Polish government leadership, and that they will have to take much tougher stand because, as I said, they think longer term, if they allow this precedent to stand, it could lead to the eventual unraveling of the European Union. But I take your point. There's as we've seen with these demonstrations of young people in Poland, there's great support, and all sorts of surveys show that 70% of the population strongly supports membership in the European Union, and it's understandable because of the huge infusions of subsidies that Poles have enjoyed and been able to greatly advance their standard of living. I mean, before Poland entered the European Union, it had roughly the same standard of living as Ukraine. Now it's 3 times as good as Ukraine. So the evidence is quite there. But I hope that there is some kind of a realization on the part of the Polish government that pushing so far against this trend is going to backfire and hurt their own interests. On your other point about Merkel, I think she broke with the previous German leadership that rather than showing a taking a European vision, she became a very firm defender of German national economic interests. In fact, the leading philosopher in Germany, Jürgen Habermas, told me, we Germans will regret having supported Merkel's vigorous economic nationalism, because it will end up burying any thoughts of an eventual United States of Europe, which has been, the title of my book about Macron is The Last President of Europe. And the reasoning behind that title is that I came to believe he's the last European leader who espouses the positions of Europe's founding fathers after World War II, in terms of looking for a more integrated political community longer term. And it's somewhat of a tragic irony that at a time when Europe perhaps has its most pro-European French leader in power, that his efforts have not been reciprocated by the German leader. So I think we'll see whether that changes with a social democrat like Olaf Scholz, but it's important for France and Germany to be in sync before Europe can make progress in the future.
Thank you very much. I wanted to follow up on the discussion we've just been having and ask if you can talk a little bit about public opinion across Europe in terms of standing up to Poland, for the EU, for the principles and the rule of law. About, I'm curious how much the sort of narrow interests of, say, trade with China, it's not so narrow, but that the government might take, how much sense is there among the populations, particularly of France and Germany and Italy, and about, feeling a threat from Russia and from China and thinking, well, that maybe we should stand up to it, and that economics alone is not what we should be worrying about, or is it just not high on the list of priorities?
Well, it's an interesting point. There are differing lobbies, particularly in Germany. There's a phenomenon called Putin-Versteher, the Putin whisperers, and it's particularly pronounced within the Social Democratic Party. Previous Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder left office and became chairman of Gazprom. He and his wife adopted 2 young boys from St. Petersburg at a time when adoption was banned. And that was clearly an effort, I think, by Putin to very long-term favor and with Schroeder and his family. But I think the automobile industry in Germany is very strongly in favor of engagement and peaceful trade relations with China. If, let's say, a scenario, if China invades Taiwan, the United States calls on the allies to adopt trade sanctions, economic sanctions against China, I think it'll be that will really be a major crisis in the alliance, because I don't see Germany going along with that at all. So in terms of China, there are a number of flashpoints on the horizon that could trigger a crisis between Europe and the United States. On Russia, I think there are also economic differences. I mean, countries like Italy, Germany also has big trade, as we see with Nord Stream 2. And of course, at the same time that other countries on Russia's border are very nervous about it. That's why they want to keep the United States engaged. And I was in Latvia interviewing. 28% of the Latvian population are ethnic Russian. So people have conceived of a scenario where, if Russia attacks Latvia under the guise of saying, oh, we're protecting the interests of ethnic Russians there, how many how many European allies would respond to an Article 5 call? Certainly not in Germany. In Germany, something like when that scenario was posed, 75% of the people say, no, it's not our conflict. We should not be part of that, even though Latvia is a NATO ally as we are. So, this I wouldn't push that too far, but it's a very worrisome trend for the future.
I'll turn to the questions from the audience. There's lots of questions from the audience. I want to hear your views on a lot of different topics. I will just pick a few of the topics that people want to hear your opinion about. Maybe first, a topic of internal French politics. There's a possibility there's another candidate of the far right in the upcoming election, Zemmour, who would split the vote on the right with on the far right with Marine Le Pen. What are your thoughts about this possibility and about this candidacy?
Well, I mean, Zemmour is an intellectual, a TV talk show host who has gotten a lot of momentum because of his stature as a television personality. His positions are, in some respects, even more extreme than Marine Le Pen. But I think that I can't see a scenario whereby Marine Le Pen would step back from the first round and allow Zemmour to go ahead. But either one of them, right now the polls are scattered all over. Macron is actually at one of the strongest positions he's had in terms of the public support. So I think his opponent in the runoff has been presumed to be Marine Le Pen until now, but that could shift. It could be any number of the candidates from the center right, or it could be even Zemmour if he gains momentum. But we're 6 months away, and a lot can happen.
Doesn't that pose a political problem for him? That if there's a candidate from the center right that gets through to the second round, maybe his chances of winning would be a little bit lower than if he were to face Le Pen again.
I think, when he's already been trying to win votes from the center right by adopting positions that are similar to theirs. I think the margin might be reduced, but I still see him being reelected. I think in any of those scenarios, I think Macron will have a second term and will be in a position to realize, or at least push forward with some of his ambitious proposals on Europe and the alliance.
Okay. Several people want to hear your views on Brexit and how it has affected transatlantic relations and how it will affect in the future.
Well, I think, Brexit's a tragedy for Britain. I mean, the Prime Minister keeps talking about global Britain, and the Alcus deal is really, Britain's role was really as an afterthought. But I think that certainly the main partner for the United States should be the European Union, 27 countries. I don't think there's much that Britain can bring even on a global basis. As I said, the military ability to project power in Britain has been greatly reduced, and we should be looking to partners such as France, which is fighting ISIS in the Sahel with the help of American intelligence and doing other other military tasks in collaboration with the United. The military relationship between France and the United States is excellent. It's just the political misunderstandings have gotten in the way. But in terms of Brexit, I don't see Britain playing more and more of a role, and I think it's going to gradually become even more enfeebled.
Related to Brexit, somebody is also asking about Ireland and whether Ireland has become a more important player in transatlantic relations as a result of Brexit, whether Ireland can now play the role of being a bridge between the EU and the US. Do you see it that way, or do you think that that bridge is not needed?
Well, I think the fact that Ireland is part of the European Union strengthens its hand with the United States. In fact, I know a number of prominent British people who are reaching back into their ancestry to find an Irish connection so that they can acquire a European passport. Yeah, there's still a strong ties with the immigrant community with Ireland. Joe Biden has Irish ancestry, and that's still strong. But there's not much that Ireland can do in terms of joining the United States, say, in projecting power in the Indo-Pacific or elsewhere.
And then with respect to France, someone is asking what's concretely what the US could do to improve its relations with France and meet some of its concerns about what's going on in the Pacific and so on.
Yeah, well, as I said, I think the easiest fix would be to bring France in as a partner in, if not Alcus, the Quad, but I mean, take advantage of the fact that France has these resources in the Indo-Pacific. They have bases in Réunion, in Djibouti, in New Caledonia, in French Polynesia, Tahiti. So these are all long-standing bases that France has used, plus 2 million people of their citizens who are living on French islands. As I said, it's the only country in the European Union that has a lasting presence. I mean, Germany made a token display, a gesture of sending a frigate to the South China Sea. Well, that doesn't really amount to much. And Britain also doesn't have a military capability to project naval power into the Indo-Pacific. So I think it's important to make France part of this community. And if we're serious about having drawing our European allies into this coalition of democracies against China.
And then related to that, so a few people are asking what role NATO can play in all this, if there is a role for NATO to play in cooperation in the Pacific.
Yeah, I think this is a much more difficult question for NATO because it is considered a North Atlantic military organization. And in the past, there were efforts to take NATO global, saying, it has to go out of area or out of business. Well, I think it's once that was tried, it was they realized that this was stretching things too far, and it also stretched the ability to achieve consensus. I don't think there will be, because NATO works by consensus, and I don't think all members of NATO would support that idea of going too far. It'll be discussed as part of this strategic concept, and the Secretary General is trying to make Europeans aware of the fact they need to be prepared to do more in the Indo-Pacific, but I don't think it's going to fly.
Are there more questions from the audience here? No? Okay, then there's nothing else left for me than to thank you very much for this very interesting talk and Q&A session. And I hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.